To the case of Shawanda Ann Cohen, a 19-year-old mother of two from Jacksonville.
Tonight, we revisit the heartbreaking 1999 case of Tyrese Mack, a young mother in Jacksonville, Florida.
Tonight, we turn to the heartbreaking 2002 case of Nikia Chanel Kilpatrick, a young mother of two from Jacksonville, Florida.
Shawanda Jefferson, a 17-year-old high school student from Jacksonville, Florida.
Amber Nicole Williams, an 18-year-old from Jacksonville.
Tonight in court, we share the story of Shawanda Denise Mallister, a 20-year-old woman from Jacksonville.
Good evening. Tonight, we take a closer look at the 1997 case of Tracy Haberssham, a young woman from Columbus, Georgia, whose night out at Fort Benning ended in tragedy.
I do want to warn you, this case is disturbing. It includes 9 victims in total, all by the hands of one evil man. These crimes spanned from Georgia to Jacksonville, Florida. The victims include 2 expecting mothers, which the unborn children are accounted for as well. And what's eerie is these are the ones that we know of. If you've been following along with my channel, you'd know I recently worked on a mini-series covering unsolved missing persons cases from Jacksonville, Florida. During that research, I stumbled across a case that shook me, not just because of how dark and eerie this case is, but because I have never heard of it before. Despite having some personal ties to North Florida and South Georgia, this one had completely slipped under my radar. I honestly debated whether or not I should cover it because I usually stick to cases to bring awareness to those who are missing. But this dark case sucked me in, and since I was already deep into a rabbit hole, I figured I might as well take my audience with me. Before I get into this case, I want to give honor to the known victims here and show their faces and names. I couldn't dare introduce this specimen before the true victims were honored. So let's take a moment and look at these beautiful faces and smiles. All beautiful women, some mothers, some barely out of high school, just starting their lives. But more importantly, all human. I guess this is when I can go ahead and talk about the man responsible. His name is Paul Durousseau. You'd think someone like this would have grown out of the Satan lava of a volcano. But no, Paul actually had a life. And although not perfect, he managed to have a wife, a career, and children. Paul Durousseau was born on August 11th, 1970 in Beaumont, Texas. He was the youngest of 2 with 1 half older brother. Unfortunately, his mother and father went their separate ways when Paul was just an infant. And it was around this time that his mother moved them to Los Angeles, California. It is said that Paul had a rough childhood that was marked by instability, witnessing abuse, and emotional neglect. Nevertheless, Paul graduated from Rosetta High School in 1989, and afterwards he landed a job working as a security guard. So at this point, Paul is not doing so bad and was maintaining his job as a security guard for a while, up until he started to get into some trouble. On December 18th, 1991, Paul was arrested in Los Angeles for carrying a concealed firearm without a permit. He was convicted and received a sentence of 3 years probation for this offense. And just a month later, on January 21st of 1992, he was arrested again on the same charge of unlawful concealed weapon. This second firearm offense led to more serious consequences, and Paul served about a year in prison as a result. After being released, Paul ended up getting a woman pregnant. And remember I mentioned he ended up having a wife and children and career? Well, this wasn't the moment exactly. Actually, Paul's choice of action, and upon learning that he had gotten someone pregnant, was to enlist in the United States Army. So in November of 1992, Paul did just that. And after he completed his basic training, his first station was in Germany. While in Germany, Paul actually met another woman, a fellow U.S. Army soldier and Jacksonville, Florida native. The two began a relationship and eventually married on May 19th of 1995. Soon after, the two would start a family and have their first daughter. So even though Paul had gotten to a little trouble back in California and basically neglected his firstborn, he was doing okay in Germany up until 1996. In 1996, Paul continued his Army enlistment, and he and the family was restationed back into the United States. a military town in Fort Benning, Georgia. This is when Paul became involved with more trouble with the law, unfortunately. And in March of 1997, he was actually arrested for kidnapping and assault for a young woman in Georgia. But Durousseau was acquitted in August of 1997 due to lack of sufficient evidence. But this seems to have been a pinpointed start of his sinister ways. I also want to notate that Paul's wife was pregnant with their second daughter during all of this. And of course, around this time, their marriage began to unravel. The couple welcomed their second daughter in September of 1997, but the allegations and Paul's increasing violence towards his wife caused her to stray, and she ended up moving her and their two daughters away from Paul and his violence, and they relocated back to Jacksonville, Florida, her hometown. Paul actually stayed behind in Georgia and managed to stay employed with the Army for a few years. But by January of '99, Paul dishonorably discharged from the Army for theft after being caught with stolen computer equipment from the military base. This is when Paul made his way to Jacksonville, Florida, to reunite with his wife and their two kids. They ended up staying in an apartment on Moncrief Road on the north side of Jacksonville, Florida. Unsurprisingly, it wasn't long before Paul brought his evil ways into the streets of Jacksonville, Florida. All while him and his wife are trying to make it work, Paul's monstrous thirst took control, and he terrorized the streets of Jacksonville. This is the part where we get into the crime spree of Paul. And although we left off where Paul ended up in Jacksonville, Florida to reunite with his wife and children, to start this timeline, I actually have to take us back to Fort Benning, Georgia.
Good evening. Tonight, we take a closer look at the 1997 case of Tracy Haberssham, a young woman from Columbus, Georgia, whose night out at Fort Benning ended in tragedy. 26-year-old Tracy Haberssham was a lifelong resident of Columbus. On the night of September 5th, 1997, she attended a weekend party at the NCO Club, the Enlisted Personnel Club located on Fort Benning's Army base. Friends and witnesses say she was in good spirits and enjoyed the night socializing. During the evening, Tracy was seen in the company of Private Paul Durousseau, a soldier stationed at Fort Benning. Several eyewitnesses reported that the two danced together at the club. It was the first and only known interaction between them. There is no indication they knew each other prior to that night. When Tracy didn't return home after the party, her family grew concerned. A search effort followed, and by September 7th, she was sadly found in a wooded area near her childhood neighborhood. Investigators determined that Tracy's life had been taken shortly after she left the Fort Benning party. Details surrounding the case revealed signs of violence, and the community was left searching for answers. For Tracy's family, the loss remains deeply felt, and her story continues to be a reminder of how one night can change everything.
So yeah, I know it's disturbing and sad. I mean, Tracy Haberssham was just a fun young woman going out to have a good time and socialize, but ended up meeting a monster with sinister intentions. And we have to keep in mind, no one knew exactly who had harmed Tracy yet. Of course, it was Paul. And if I can remember it correctly, this man was married and had a pregnant wife at home at the time. The couple had restationed to Fort Benning just a year before, and he was already on the roll. Now we'll take you all through the victims in Jacksonville, Florida. And I'll be honest, I want to give you a trigger warning. These victims bared no better fate than Tracy, and it became quite overwhelming in my research into the victims' cases. So I just wanted to warn you before we go into these. You're welcome to skip over them or take a break if you need to. Let's continue.
Tonight, we revisit the heartbreaking 1999 case of Tracy Mack, a young mother in Jacksonville, Florida, whose life was taken in the middle of the day. It was the morning of July 26, 1999. 24-year-old Tracy Mack had spent the early part of her day out with a friend, looking for job opportunities. By early afternoon, she had returned to her apartment. At approximately 1:25 p.m., Teresa spoke on the phone with a friend named Erica. That brief conversation would turn out to be the last time anyone heard her voice. Sometime later, neighbors reported seeing a tall man leaving Teresa's apartment, carrying her television. The man reportedly matched the description of Paul Durousseau, a name that would soon surface in multiple investigations. Later that evening, Teresa was found inside her bedroom. Authorities determined she had lost her life in an extremely violent incident. Her apartment had been ransacked, and several belongings were missing. At the time of the incident, Teresa's children were not home. While the loss remains devastating, that detail offered at least one small relief in an otherwise unthinkable tragedy.
In tonight's report, we remember Nicole Williams, an 18-year-old from Jacksonville whose promising life was cut short just days before the holidays in 2002. Nicole Williams had recently graduated high school. She was stepping into adulthood, full of hope for the future. But on the evening of December 17, 2002, she left her family's home in Jacksonville and never came back. 2 days later, on December 19th, Nicole's body was discovered in a ditch off Sutel Drive. She had been wrapped in a light blue blanket, left behind in a quiet area of town. Investigators found that Nicole's hands had been bound, and she had lost her life in a way that matched several other unsolved cases in the region.
Tonight, we turn to the heartbreaking 2002 case of Nikia Chanel Kilpatrick, a young mother of two from Jacksonville, Florida, whose final moments remain deeply troubling, not only for what she endured, but for what her children witnessed. It was the evening of December 29th, 2002, and 19-year-old Nikia Kilpatrick was at home in her apartment at the Spanish Oaks complex. She was a dedicated mother to two young sons, just 2 years old and 11 months, and was also 6 months pregnant. That night, her sister dropped by and found Nikia acting unusually quiet. She was on the phone, speaking softly, and abruptly hung up when her sister entered the room. That would be the last time anyone saw her alive. Calls to Nikia went unanswered over the next 2 days. On New Year's Day, her family returned to check on her and found a devastating scene inside the apartment. Nikia had been found in her bedroom, her life taken under deeply violent and calculated circumstances. A coaxial cable had been used in the assault, tied with what investigators described as a precise slipknot. She had been harmed while her two young children were still inside the home. Miraculously, both boys survived. They had been alone in the apartment for nearly 48 hours, trying to care for themselves by eating what little food they could find. They were visibly shaken, but alive, a small light in an otherwise dark and deeply disturbing case.
I want to stop here at Nikia's case for a moment. Not only did he commit these horrible acts upon Nikia, it was later found out that Paul's wife was the person who actually dropped him off at Nikia's residence that day. His wife couldn't have imagined that she was dropping her husband off to commit such a horrible act. He actually orchestrated his wife to drop him off at the residence of one of his victims. And not only a victim, but a pregnant victim that had 2 of her children at home at the time of his evil acts. And you would think after this, Paul would be satisfied, but he wasn't. At this time of Nikia's demise, Paul was still not caught, and he still had his hungry, sinister cravings. So this is when he victimized yet another beautiful young expecting mother. Her name was Shawanda Mallister.
In tonight's report, we share the story of Shawanda Denise Mallister, a 20-year-old woman from Jacksonville, Florida, whose life was on the rise, until a single cab ride took it all away. Shawanda was a certified nursing assistant and had just started school to advance her career in healthcare. She paid the bills, balanced her coursework, and was engaged to her fiancé, Rashid Topi. The couple shared an apartment on Arco Drive and were expecting their first child together. Shawanda was 3 months pregnant. On January 9th, 2003, Shawanda spent her day running errands and attending school programs. That evening, she got into a Gator City taxi to head home. It would later be confirmed that her driver that night was Paul Durousseau, on his very first day working as a cab driver. Around 9:30 p.m., neighbors saw Shawanda standing in her doorway, speaking on the phone. Moments later, her fiancé arrived home, but couldn't get inside. He heard a man's voice through the window, saying, "Shawanda don't want to see you no more. I'm pregnant." Alarmed, he left and later returned, forcing his way in. Inside, he found Shawanda unresponsive on the bedroom floor. She had been strangled with an extension cord and left partially undressed. Her life, and the life she was carrying, had been taken in an act of senseless cruelty. What happened to Shawanda helped investigators connect a pattern of similar cases, all pointing back to one man. Tonight, we reflect on the case of Giovanna Tirica Jefferson, a 17-year-old high school student from Jacksonville, Florida. She was still living at home, still in school, and still discovering who she wanted to become, when one ordinary cab ride changed everything. On the night of January 20th, 2003, Giovanna was last seen getting into a taxi outside her home on West 8th Street. The driver was Paul Durousseau, recently hired by Gator City Taxi. That would be the last time anyone saw her alive.
In this report, we turn to the case of Sarita Ann Cohen, a 19-year-old mother of 2 from Jacksonville, Florida, whose life was cut short after what should have been a routine ride across town. Sarita lived in an apartment off Moncrief Road. She was known by her family as someone who loved her children deeply and took her responsibilities seriously, despite her young age. Her days were focused on motherhood and building a life for her small family. On the evening of February 4, 2003, Sarita reportedly called for a taxi. She was picked up by Paul Durousseau, who at the time was working as a driver for Gator City Taxi. Witnesses confirmed that she entered his cab, a ride believed to be for a personal errand. There is no indication that she knew Durousseau personally. Sarita never returned home. The very next day, on February 5th, her body was found in a vacant lot off New Kings Road, lying in a shallow ditch. In a heartbreaking and disturbing detail, she was discovered just 6 feet away from another victim, 17-year-old Jovanna Jefferson, who had vanished 2 weeks earlier.
Paul had managed to victimize all these women in Jacksonville in just a few years span. He was absolutely terrorizing the communities, and authorities were now sure of the pattern. And just because authorities hadn't quite put their finger on it yet, they had their eyes on Paul and had every reason to believe he was the one guilty of these crimes. Paul had been witnessed being connected to or around the area of the victims, or in contact with the victims by witnesses and neighbors of residences. The authorities were also able to obtain phone call records. Combining all of this along with Durousseau's criminal past, investigators were quite sure. But they needed a way to get Paul's DNA and any more evidence they could to build a strong case against Durousseau. So, on February 6, 2003, the day after the last 2 victims, Jefferson and Cohen, were found, police arrested Paul for violating probation from a 2001 conviction. This strategic arrest allowed authorities to hold Durousseau while they further gathered evidence. Although DNA analysis wasn't as evolved when these crimes happened, authorities and forensic investigators still took samples from the crime scenes, and so when they were able to retrieve Paul's DNA upon his arrest, they sent those results in to check for any matches. It took some time, but when the results came back in, they were a match. And on June 17, 2003, Paul was formally charged with the Duval slaying of Nicole Williams, Nakia Kilpatrick, Shawanda Mallister, Jovanna Jefferson, and Sarita Cohen. The forensic labs from the 1999 case with Tracy Mack took a bit more time, but they finally came through, and to no surprise, there was indeed a DNA match to Paul Durousseau's profile. Although Durousseau was already jailed, a new arrest warrant was issued, and a grand jury returned an indictment for Mack's demise. On September 4, 2003, this became the 6th Florida charge against him. Around the same time, authorities in Georgia revisited the unsolved 97 case of Tracy Haberssham. After coordinating with Florida investigators, police filed charges against Paul for Habersham's case as well. Paul Durousseau's day in court arrived in 2007, and Paul actually represented himself. The trial was limited to the case of Tracy Mack, as her case had the strongest evidence to be able to present to a jury to have the best chances of conviction. But the findings of the other cases and victims were presented, which helped secure the jury that Paul was a danger to society. So after 2 weeks, the jury ended up finding Paul guilty of first degree for Tracy Mack. And in a separate penalty phase, Paul was sentenced to the death sentence, and he actually sat on death row for about a decade, all while attempting to appeal and overturn his conviction. But none of those appeals stuck, and he sat there rotting like he deserved. But in January of 2017, a change in Florida law, which requires a unanimous decision on the death sentence, Durousseau's 10-2 jury recommendation did not meet this new constitutional requirement. Consequently, the Florida Supreme Court vacated his death sentence in 2017 while leaving the murder conviction intact. This meant Durousseau was entitled to a new sentencing hearing. So, a few years later, in 2021, a new jury was selected and a type of mini trial was held, in which the jury heard all the evidence of Durousseau's crimes again. In December of 2021, the new jury again returned a 10-2 vote in favor of the death penalty. But with the new laws of a unanimous decision, the judge was forced to impose a life sentence. So, on December 10, 2021, 2001, Paul was formally resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and to this day, he remains behind bars, where he deserves to be. Obviously, this case was super disturbing, and none of the outcomes were good. At the end of the day, Paul gets to live out the remaining of his life like a peasant behind bars. But none of these victims had a choice in the matter. They didn't have a choice in their lives. I cover a lot of missing persons cases, and I guess in those it leaves room for a little dash of hope. The soft cases are a little harder for me to cover because there's a grievance that comes with it all, and that can be a lot at times. I won't ponder on about Paul. I refuse. There are a lot of videos and information digging into the mind of Paul and giving excuses on why he did what he did. But although my jar of empathy is usually overflowing, after learning of the victims and digging into this case and learning about all the families he tore apart, I can see him personally as nothing more than a monster. So with that, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe. And if nothing else, leave some purple hearts and emojis in the comments or some supportive words for the victims and their families. I do have families who watch these videos, so I really appreciate those of you who leave simple hearts or a caring comment. Even opinions are welcome as long as they're respectful. With that, thank you all for listening, and until next time.
If you believe in keeping these cases present and bringing awareness to each story, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps more people find these stories and helps keep them from being forgotten.